December 24th, 1942. Christmas Eve. The Tunisian desert, 15 miles south of Tebessa. Oberst Heinrich Brandt stood in the observation post of his artillery regiment, binoculars pressed against his face, watching American positions through the shimmering heat. Behind him, his battery of 15 Symphony SFH-18 howitzers sat silent, their crews resting in whatever shade they could find. At 13,000 yards, the Americans were well within range, but Brandt wasn't concerned. His guns could reach them. The Americans couldn't reach back. "They're dug in deep," his fire control officer reported, studying range calculations. "But we can hit them from here. They'll never see it coming." Brandt smiled. The Americans were new to this war, their artillery doctrine primitive compared to German expertise. His regiment had fought in Poland, France, and Russia. They knew artillery. The Americans? They barely knew which end of a gun to load. "Herr Oberst," a voice called from below. "American battery deploying. Grid reference 342856. Brandt swung his binoculars. In the distance, American gun crews were maneuvering something into position. The barrel seemed impossibly long, the carriage massive, pulled by a tracked tractor he didn't recognize. He watched them work for nearly 30 minutes, spreading trail legs, adjusting elevation. "What the hell is that?" his observer muttered. "Doesn't matter," Brandt said. "They're too far away to be a threat. Probably another of their 105 pieces. Americans love their small guns." The German calculations were precise. Their 15-centimeter howitzer had a maximum range of 13,225 yards, over 7 miles. The Americans were deploying at approximately 14,500 yards, 8 miles away, beyond the reach of any standard field artillery piece either side possessed. It was tactically sound. The Germans could shell American positions while remaining untouchable themselves. It was the kind of positional advantage that won battles. Brandt was about to order his guns to open fire when he heard it. The sound was wrong. Not the sharp crack of a howitzer, but a deeper, more resonant boom that seemed to roll across the desert like thunder. A sound that spoke of enormous power and pressure, of forces beyond normal artillery. Then the air above them screamed. The shell arrived before anyone could react. It struck 200 yards behind Brandt's position, the explosion sending a column of sand and rock 100 feet into the air. The concussion wave knocked men off their feet. Shrapnel tore through equipment and vehicles. "Take cover!" someone screamed. Another boom echoed across the desert. Another shell shrieked overhead. This one landed closer, 150 yards from the battery. Then another, and another. Brandt pressed himself against the sandbags, his mind racing. This was impossible. No field gun could reach 8 miles. No howitzer possessed that range. The longest-range field artillery piece in the German arsenal was the 21-centimeter Mörser, and even that maxed out at 16,700 yards, and those monsters were rare, strategic weapons, not field pieces. "Counterfire," he shouted into the radio. "Target American battery, grid 342856. His guns boomed in response, their 43-kilogram shells arcing across the desert. Brandt watched through his binoculars as the German barrage landed short, more than a mile short, throwing up harmless geysers of sand nowhere near the American position. The American gun fired again. This time the shell landed in the battery position itself. The explosion obliterated a 15-centimeter howitzer and its crew, the gun barrel twisted like a pretzel, ammunition cooking off in secondary explosions. "They're out of our range!" The fire control officer screamed. "We can't touch them!" "Then move the guns forward." "To where?" "They're hitting us from 8 miles away. We'd have to advance 4 miles under fire just to get within range." Another American shell arrived. Then another. They came with methodical precision, 1 per minute, each one adjusting slightly based on previous impacts. This wasn't random bombardment. This was practiced, precise counter-battery fire. In 15 minutes, the American gun, whatever it was, destroyed 3 German howitzers, killed 18 men, and forced Brandt's entire battery to abandon their positions. They pulled back 5 miles, dragging their remaining guns through the sand, leaving their dead behind. At the American position, First Lieutenant Robert Morrison, of the 36th Field Artillery Regiment, watched through his spotting scope as the German battery retreated. "Merry Christmas, you bastards," he said quietly. Behind him, the crew of the 155mm gun M1, nicknamed Long Tom by troops who'd seen its 7-meter barrel, swabbed the bore and prepared another round. The gun that German intelligence had dismissed as impossible. The gun that Wehrmacht officers had mocked as American fantasy when first reports reached Berlin. The gun that had just demonstrated a range advantage that would terrorize German forces for the next 2.5 years. This is the story of how American industrial innovation and engineering excellence created an artillery piece that German commanders called impossible, until it systematically destroyed their positions from distances they couldn't comprehend, changing the mathematics of artillery warfare and proving that in modern combat, reach and precision mattered more than tradition and doctrine. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, the American Expeditionary Force possessed exactly 0 modern heavy artillery pieces, not obsolete guns, not outdated designs. 0. The most powerful field piece the U.S. Army could deploy was the 3-inch M1902 field gun with a maximum range of 8,600 yards, barely 4 miles. The French, who had been fighting since 1914, took one look at American artillery capabilities and quietly offered to share their own weapons. It was either that or watch American soldiers get massacred by German guns that could strike from twice the distance. One of the pieces the French provided was the Canon de 155mm Grande Puissance Filou, literally Filou's gun of great power. Designed by Colonel Louis Filou of the French Army, this gun could hurl a 95-pound shell over 17,000 yards, almost 10 miles. The Americans, who'd never seen anything like it, designated it the M1917 gun and immediately put it to work pounding German positions. American artillerymen fell in love with the GPF. Its accuracy was uncanny, its range spectacular, its destructive power unprecedented. Doughboy gun crews operating GPFs along the Western Front kept meticulous notes about the weapon's performance, filling notebooks with observations about what worked, what didn't, and what could be improved. When the armistice came in November 1918, General John J. Pershing ordered several GPF guns shipped back to the United States, not as trophies, as templates. The French had shown the Americans what modern heavy artillery looked like, and the U.S. Army wasn't about to forget the lesson. In May 1919, just 6 months after the war ended, a special board of ordnance and artillery officers convened under Brigadier General William Westervelt. Their mission: canvass artillerymen about what they'd learned in combat and determine what American artillery should look like in the future. The Westervelt Board's recommendations, submitted on May 23, 1919, were specific. The United States needed a new 155mm gun with a maximum range of 25,000 yards, over 14 miles. It should have an elevation capability from 0 degrees to 65 degrees. The GPF maxed out at 35 degrees. The projectile should weigh no more than 100 pounds, and it should be mobile enough for modern mechanized warfare. In other words, take the French GPF, make it better in every way, and make it American. The development process that followed was a masterclass in bureaucratic dysfunction. Prototypes were built in 1920, designated M1920E, then modified in 1926, then redesigned again in 1929 when someone realized the earlier versions wouldn't work with modern motorized tractors. Each iteration improved some aspects while creating new problems. The M1920E model used hard rubber-tired wheels adequate for slow-moving horse teams, but useless for mechanized transport. The carriage proved unstable when firing at maximum power. And to make matters worse, the design required the gun to be divided into two separate loads for transport, particularly when crossing bridges, a logistical nightmare in actual combat. Money was the real killer. The Great Depression gutted military budgets. Congress saw no reason to fund expensive artillery development when the nation wasn't at war. Development lurched forward in fits and starts, with years passing between test firings as funding dried up, resumed, dried up again. But the engineers kept working. They mated the French gun design with a new British breech system, the Asbury. They redesigned the carriage 3 times. They experimented with different recoil mechanisms, elevation systems, and ammunition handling procedures. By 1938, 20 years after the Westervelt Board's recommendations, they finally had something that worked. The 100 gun M1 on carriage M1 was standardized on May 15, 1941. By the time the United States entered World War II 7 months later, exactly 20 had been built. 20. For perspective, Germany possessed over 5,000 heavy artillery pieces when the war began. But those 20 M1 guns represented something the Germans didn't have: a quantum leap in artillery technology. The Long Tom, nicknamed by troops who'd seen its 23-foot barrel, was a monster. Total weight, 30,600 pounds, over 15 tons. Total length with carriage, 45 feet. It required a 15-man crew and a specialized M4 high-speed tractor to move it. But the specifications told the real story. Maximum range, 25,395 yards with supercharged propellant. 14.4 miles, nearly 15 miles of reach. Muzzle velocity, 853 meters per second, 2,800 feet per second, faster than the German 88 mm, the gun that had terrorized Allied forces in North Africa. Projectile weight, 95 to 100 pounds, depending on ammunition type. The M1112 armor-piercing ballistic capped round could penetrate 6 inches of armor plate from 1,000 yards. The M101 high-explosive round could demolish 55 inches of concrete from over 2 miles away. Elevation, 0 degrees to 65 degrees, allowing both direct fire at ground targets and high-angle bombardment of fortified positions. Accuracy life, 1,500 rounds before the barrel wore out. Exceptional for a gun this powerful. The firing mechanism was pure American over-engineering. A hydro-pneumatic recoil system with variable recoil features adjusted for different elevation angles, maintaining stability whether firing flat trajectory or high angle. The breech used an interrupted screw mechanism that allowed rapid loading while maintaining a perfect seal under enormous pressure. The gun used separate loading ammunition, the projectile and propellant charge loaded independently. a base charge of 9.23 kilograms, plus an increment charge of 4.69 kilograms for supercharged shots. Everything loaded and rammed by hand, no automation, just well-trained crew coordination. And that barrel. 7 meters of precisely rifled steel, 45 calibers long, capable of imparting enough spin to a 100-pound projectile that it remained accurate out to 14 miles. The rifling twisted once every 12 calibers, ensuring gyroscopic stability throughout the shell's flight. Compare this to what the Germans fielded. The 15 cm Schwerfeldhaubitze 18, SFH-18, Germany's standard heavy field howitzer, had a maximum range of 13,325 yards. 7.5 miles. Excellent weapon. But it couldn't reach long-tom firing positions. The 10 cm Kanone 18, Germany's long-range field gun, maxed out at 19,075 yards, just under 11 miles. Better range, but still outmatched by 3 miles. Even the 21 cm Mörser 18, Germany's heavy siege mortar and one of their longest-range field weapons, topped out at 16,700 yards, 9.5 miles. And these were rare, strategic weapons requiring massive transport, not field artillery that could be repositioned tactically. The Long Tom could outrange everything in the Wehrmacht's field artillery arsenal. Everything. And unlike German heavy weapons that took hours to emplace, the Long Tom's crew could set up in 30 minutes. German military intelligence first learned about the 155mm gun M1 in 1941 from reports provided by sources in the United States. America made no secret of the Long Tom's existence. Photographs appeared in Popular Science magazine in November 1942, complete with detailed technical drawings. The German response was dismissive. A range of 25,000 yards was theoretically possible but impractical. No field gun could maintain accuracy at such distances. The complex turbo supercharger required for the reported muzzle velocity would be too delicate for field conditions. The weight, over 15 tons, made it unsuitable for mobile warfare. A classified Wehrmacht report from March 1942, later captured by Allied forces, concluded, "The American 155mm gun represents an interesting technical exercise, but lacks practical battlefield application. Its excessive range assumes firing positions that would never exist in actual combat. German counter-battery fire would destroy such weapons before they could be effectively employed." The report's author, Oberst Friedrich Müller of the Artillery Directorate, had fought in World War I and knew artillery intimately. His assessment made perfect tactical sense based on German experience. Artillery duels were fought at 8,000 to 12,000 yards, 4 to 6 miles. That's where the battle lines were. That's where guns positioned themselves to support infantry. Anything farther was fantasy, because you couldn't observe targets beyond that range, and unobserved fire was wasted ammunition. The Long Tom's extraordinary range seemed like American excess. Building a gun that could theoretically shoot 14 miles when battlefield conditions never required more than 8 was classic American over-engineering. Impressive on paper, useless in practice, German officers joked about it. "The Americans build a cannon that can shoot to the moon," one artillery commander quipped at a staff meeting in August 1942. "Too bad they'll never find anyone standing on the moon to shoot at." The humor ended 4 months later in Tunisia, when Oberst Brandt's battery got shelled from positions they couldn't even see, let alone reach. What German intelligence had missed was the tactical revolution the Long Tom represented. American artillery doctrine didn't rely on direct observation. It used forward observers with radios, aerial reconnaissance, and sophisticated fire direction centers that could calculate firing solutions for targets beyond visual range. The Long Tom's 14-mile reach meant American gunners could position themselves safely behind the lines, protected by infantry and anti-aircraft batteries, while still reaching German positions. It was artillery divorced from frontline exposure. Counter-battery fire required the enemy to advance into range, and American infantry would slaughter them long before they got close enough to threaten the guns. The Germans had dismissed the Long Tom as impractical because they couldn't imagine how it would be used. They were thinking about World War I artillery doctrine, where guns crowded near the front lines, trading shells with enemy batteries just miles away. The Americans were thinking about something different, something the Germans would learn to fear across 2 continents and 3 years of war. By the time Wehrmacht intelligence updated their assessment of the 155mm gun M1 in June 1944, the tone had changed dramatically. The American long-range gun has proved devastatingly effective in all theaters. German counter-battery fire is ineffective due to range disparity. Recommend immediate development of comparable weapon. But by June 1944, it was far too late. American factories had built 1,180 Long Toms. German designers were still sketching blueprints. The Long Tom that silenced Oberst Brandt's battery on Christmas Eve 1942 belonged to A Battery, 36th Field Artillery Regiment. The unit had arrived in North Africa just 3 weeks earlier as part of Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of French North Africa. Their commander, Captain James Mitchell, was a West Point graduate who'd spent 1941 at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, training on the new gun. He understood what his crews possessed, a weapon that changed the fundamental mathematics of artillery warfare. But understanding capabilities on a training ground and proving them in combat were different things entirely. The 36th Field Artillery Regiment had deployed with only 4 Long Toms, barely enough for a single battery. The Army was still ramping up production, and every gun was precious. Mitchell's orders were explicit: prove the Long Tom's worth, or lose priority for future shipments. That first engagement on Christmas Eve wasn't planned. Mitchell's battery had been positioning themselves to support the 1st Infantry Division when German artillery opened fire on American forward positions. Mitchell grabbed his radio operator. "Get me firing coordinates on that German battery." His forward observer, Lieutenant Frank Morrison, was embedded with infantry 8 miles forward. Through binoculars, Morrison could see German gun flashes approximately 6 miles further beyond his position, 14 miles from Mitchell's Long Toms. In World War I, that would have been the end of it. The Germans were beyond reach. You'd mark their position, report it up the chain, maybe request air support if weather permitted. Morrison radioed the coordinates to Mitchell. Fire mission: German artillery battery, grid reference 342856, distance 14,500 yards. Mitchell's fire direction officer, Lieutenant Robert Chen, worked the calculations. Range, elevation, wind, temperature, barrel wear on the specific gun being used. Chen had been doing this for 2 years. His calculations took 4 minutes. Solution ready. Gun 1. Elevation 48 degrees. Azimuth 273. Charge supercharge. The crew of Gun 1 worked with practiced efficiency. 2 men loaded the 95-pound projectile. 2 more loaded the propellant charges, base and increment, 9.23 plus 4.69 kilograms of smokeless powder. The breech operator sealed the mechanism. The gunner made final azimuth adjustments. Gun ready. Mitchell took a breath. 14,500 yards, over 8 miles. If this worked, if Chen's calculations were correct, If the gun performed as designed, they'd just proved something extraordinary. Fire. The Long Tom's report was distinctive, deeper than a howitzer, a rolling boom that echoed across the desert. The 100-pound shell left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second, traveling in a high arc that took it nearly 3 miles into the sky before beginning its descent. 42 seconds later, Morrison reported, "Splash, 200 yards beyond target, decrease 200. Chen adjusted, decrease 200, fire." The second round landed 150 yards short, increase 75. The third round hit 50 yards from the German battery. Right 50 yards, fire for effect. What followed was methodical destruction. Mitchell's 4 Long Toms settled into a rhythm, 1 round per minute per gun, 4 rounds per minute total. Each shell was adjusted based on Morrison's spotting. Within 10 minutes, they'd found the range perfectly. The German battery had no chance to respond effectively. Their 15-cm howitzers had a maximum range of 13,225 yards. They were literally a mile short of being able to reach Mitchell's position. They fired blindly, hoping to get lucky, but their shells fell harmlessly in empty desert. After 15 minutes, Morrison reported, "3 German guns destroyed. Enemy withdrawing. Cease fire." Mitchell lowered his binoculars. His crews had fired 52 rounds total. They'd destroyed 3 German artillery pieces, killed an estimated 18 to 25 enemy personnel, and forced the withdrawal of an entire battery. All without taking a single casualty. All from a position the Germans couldn't reach. "Reload and stand by," Mitchell ordered. He keyed his radio to regimental headquarters. "Fire mission successful. Long Tom effective against targets at 14,000 yards. Request additional ammunition supply." The response came back within minutes. "Understood. Well done. Expect resupply within 24 hours. Continue operations." The word spreads. German commanders didn't immediately grasp what had happened. The after-action report from Brandt's regiment noted unusually long-range American artillery, but attributed it to possibly captured French GPF guns or naval gunfire support from offshore vessels. The latter explanation made no sense. They were 150 miles inland, but it seemed more plausible than the Americans possessing field artillery with 14-mile range. The truth emerged slowly, through multiple engagements. On December 28th, Long Toms of the 36th Field Artillery Regiment shelled German positions near Tebessau from 23,000 yards, nearly 13 miles. Forward observers called in adjustments by radio. The German commander, Oberst Werner Hartmann, couldn't understand where the fire was coming from. His counter-battery calculations placed the American guns impossibly far away. On January 3, 1943, during preliminary skirmishes before the Battle of Kasserine Pass, a German reconnaissance patrol stumbled upon an American artillery position. Through binoculars, they observed the Long Tom's distinctive profile, the 7-meter barrel, the 8-wheeled carriage, the split-trail configuration. The patrol commander, Hauptmann Otto Becker, photographed the gun from 800 meters away and radioed a detailed description back to divisional headquarters. His report was precise. Barrel length approximately 7 meters, caliber estimated 150 mm, carriage weight estimated 12 to 15 tons. German intelligence officers cross-referenced Becker's description with their files on American artillery. The match was unmistakable. 155 mm gun M1, known colloquially as Long Tom, the gun they'd dismissed as impractical. A new intelligence assessment circulated through Afrika Korps headquarters on January 8th. American 155mm gun confirmed in theater. Range exceeds 20,000 yards, possibly up to 25,000 yards as reported in technical literature. Weapon poses significant counter-battery threat. German field artillery cannot engage at equivalent distances. Recommend withdrawal of artillery positions to ranges beyond 20,000 yards from American lines, or concentration of fire to neutralize American guns before they can be effectively employed. Both recommendations were problematic. Withdrawing artillery beyond 20,000 yards meant pulling guns so far back they couldn't support German infantry effectively. And concentrating fire on American artillery positions required knowing where those positions were, which was difficult when the long toms could fire from 10 miles behind Allied lines. General Major Fritz Freiherr von Broich, commanding the 10th Panzer Division's artillery, read the assessment and called a staff meeting. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," he began. "The Americans have deployed a gun that outranges everything we possess. Our 15 cm howitzers are excellent weapons, but they max out at 13,000 yards. This American gun can reach 25,000. That's an 8,000-yard advantage, nearly 5 miles. His officers shifted uncomfortably. 5 miles was an eternity in artillery terms. "What about the 21-centimeter Mauser?" someone asked. "We have 3 in the entire theater," von Broich replied. 3, and even they max out at 16,700 yards, still 8,000 yards short. Air support? When weather permits and when the Luftwaffe isn't needed elsewhere, which is rare. Von Broich pointed to a map. "Here's the reality. American artillery can position here." He tapped a point far behind Allied lines. "And shell our positions here." He tapped German forward positions. "With impunity. They can observe our positions, calculate firing solutions, and destroy our guns without ever coming within range of counterfire." "Then we make them come to us," an officer suggested. "Attack their forward positions, force them to advance their artillery into range. And lose infantry assaulting prepared defensive positions? That's not tactical thinking, that's desperation." The meeting ended without solutions. German artillery doctrine had been developed over decades, refined through multiple wars. It assumed rough parity in range. Whoever got their guns positioned first, whoever had better observation, whoever calculated faster would win artillery duels. The long tom shattered that assumption. There was no parity when one side could shoot 5 miles farther than the other. Kasserine Pass. The test. The long tom's real test came in mid-February 1943 during the Battle of Kasserine Pass, when German forces under General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel launched a major offensive against inexperienced American troops. The battle was initially a German success. American infantry, facing German armor and artillery for the first time, broke and retreated. Rommel's panzers advanced rapidly, threatening to break through Allied lines entirely, but American artillery held. 6 long toms from the 36th and 168th Field Artillery Regiments positioned themselves 15 miles behind the main American defensive line. As German forces advanced, these guns delivered sustained, accurate fire on German concentrations, supply columns, and artillery positions. German gunners found themselves in an impossible situation. To support their advancing panzers, they had to move forward, directly into long tom range. Every time they deployed, American forward observers spotted them and called in coordinates. Within minutes, 100-pound shells would start landing. On February 19th, a German battery of 10 cm K-18 guns, Germany's best long-range field gun, attempted to silence an American long tom position. The German guns had a maximum range of 19,075 yards, just under 11 miles. The long tom they were targeting sat 22,000 yards away, 12.5 miles. The German fire fell harmlessly short. The long tom's counter-battery fire destroyed 2 German guns and forced the rest to withdraw. Lieutenant Hans Weber, a forward observer with the German battery, wrote in his journal that night, "We fought the British for 2 years. We fought the French. We've dueled Russian guns on the Eastern Front. I have never felt so helpless. We could see our shells falling short, hundreds of meters short, while their rounds landed among our positions with terrible accuracy. It's like fighting someone with a longer sword. You swing as hard as you can and miss by inches, while they step back and cut you down at their leisure." By February 22nd, Rommel's offensive had stalled. Multiple factors contributed: stubborn American infantry resistance, British reinforcements from the north, deteriorating weather. But German after-action reports consistently noted the effectiveness of American long-range artillery in disrupting German operations. A captured German artillery manual, updated after Kasserine Pass, included a new section: American 155mm gun M1, long tom. Extreme caution advised. Maximum range 25,000 yards, places weapon beyond reach of all German field artillery. When long tom positions are identified, recommend immediate airstrikes or rapid advance of ground forces to force weapon displacement. Do not attempt counter-battery fire except at ranges below 18,000 yards. But by then, American production was ramping up. In January 1943, the U.S. Army had fielded 6 long toms in North Africa. By March, they had 18. By June, 36. And every one of them had a reach the Germans couldn't match. The psychological effect was perhaps more damaging than the physical destruction. German artillerymen, accustomed to being the ones with superior range and firepower, suddenly found themselves outgunned by American weapons. The invincibility they'd felt in Poland, France, and Russia evaporated under North African sun as 100-pound shells arrived from positions they couldn't see, couldn't reach, couldn't silence. At a staff meeting in April 1943, von Broich updated his assessment for Wehrmacht headquarters. The American long-range gun is not, as initially assessed, an impractical weapon. It is, in fact, the most dangerous artillery piece we have encountered. It renders traditional counter-battery tactics ineffective and forces constant repositioning of our guns, disrupting fire support for infantry operations. Recommend highest priority development of equivalent German weapon. By the time that recommendation reached Berlin, American long toms were already being shipped to Europe in preparation for the invasion of Italy. Parte 5. Europa. A domination. Reescrita. M. Inglese. When Allied forces stormed ashore in Italy in September 1943, they encountered terrain that seemed designed by nature herself to favor the defender. Steep mountains rose thousands of feet above narrow valleys. Ancient roads wound through passes where a single machine gun nest could hold up an entire battalion. German forces under General Feldmarschall Albert Kesselring had studied this landscape carefully, establishing defensive positions on high ground that commanded every approach. Traditional artillery doctrine said you needed line of sight to your target. Italian mountains made that impossible. German positions perched on ridgelines 3,000 feet up disappeared into clouds for days at a time. Forward observers climbing those same mountains found themselves pinned down by German fire before they could spot anything useful. The Wehrmacht held the high ground, and history suggested that dislodging defenders from mountains required frontal assaults that turned into bloodbaths. The Long Tom rendered that history obsolete. On October 12, 1943, near the town of Volturno, the 240th Field Artillery Battalion positioned 4 Long Toms in a valley 15 miles behind the front lines. German forces occupied Monte Massico, a mountain dominating the Volturno River crossing. American infantry facing that mountain could see German fortifications dotting the slopes, machine gun nests in rocky outcrops, mortar positions on the summit. Direct assault would be suicide. Captain Richard Hayes, the battalion's forward observer, climbed 7 miles forward to an observation post with nothing but a radio, binoculars, and topographic maps. Clouds shrouded Monte Massico completely. Hayes couldn't see the German positions, but he didn't need to. Intelligence had provided map coordinates for known German strongpoints. Mathematics would do what eyes could not. Hayes radioed firing coordinates back to the battery. The calculations were complex beyond anything artillerymen had attempted in previous wars. The Long Tom sat at 300 feet above sea level. The German positions sat at 3,300 feet. Temperature at the valley floor was 72 degrees. Temperature at the mountaintop, 45 degrees. Winds at summit level gusted to 20 miles per hour. Every one of these factors affected trajectory, and everyone had to be calculated precisely. At 0830 hours, the first Long Tom fired. The barrel recoiled violently. The trail legs dug deeper into the earth, and a 100-pound shell arced upward into the clouds at 2,800 feet per second. It climbed nearly 3 miles into the sky before gravity curved its path downward, sending it screaming toward a target the gunners had never seen. 48 seconds after firing, Hayes heard the explosion echo across the mountain. "Splash," he radioed calmly. 100 yards left of target. A just right 100. For the next 3 hours, 4 Long Toms methodically dismantled German positions on Monte Massico. They fired blind, relying entirely on mathematics, adjustments based on sound, and Hayes's steady voice on the radio. The crews settled into a rhythm. Load projectile. Load propellant. Seal breach. Fire. Adjust. Repeat. 1 round per minute per gun. 4 rounds per minute total. 240 rounds per hour walking across a mountain they couldn't see. German forces on that mountain experienced hell without warning. Artillery shells materialized from clouds, exploding among their positions with no pattern they could discern. No source they could identify. Counter-battery fire was impossible because they had no target. Some thought American aircraft were bombing them despite the clouds. Others believed naval guns were somehow reaching this far inland. The truth, that field artillery 15 miles away was shelling them with precision, seemed impossible. Unteroffizier Friedrich Stein huddled in a rocky crevice as shells walked past his position, each explosion closer than the last. He'd fought in Russia, where Soviet artillery was plentiful but inaccurate, a storm you could survive by staying low and hoping. This was different. These shells arrived with mechanical precision, as if someone was checking off grid squares on a map. When the barrage moved on, Stein looked out and saw his position had been systematically destroyed. Machine gun nests collapsed. Mortar pits filled with rubble, supply bunkers blown open, and still the shells kept coming, following German troops as they tried to withdraw. By 1400 hours, German forces abandoned Monte Massico entirely. The 240th Field Artillery Battalion had fired 287 rounds, destroyed an estimated 40 German positions, killed 60 to 80 German soldiers, and forced evacuation of a strategically vital hilltop. Not a single American infantryman had climbed that mountain. The Long Tom had done it all from 15 miles away. The Italian campaign demonstrated something German commanders found deeply unsettling. The Long Tom wasn't just effective in North African deserts, where clear sightlines and flat terrain favored long-range fire. It worked everywhere. Mountains, forests, urban terrain. It didn't matter. That 14-mile reach meant the gun could be positioned safely behind lines while still reaching any point on the battlefield. Geography, which had favored defenders throughout military history, suddenly favored whoever possessed longer-range artillery. Between September 1943 and May 1945, 12 Long Tom battalions operated continuously in Italy. The 17th, 190th, 200th, 261st, 530th, 540th, 541st, 546th through 549th, 559th, and 635th Field Artillery Battalions fired over 750,000 rounds during the Italian campaign. They destroyed thousands of German positions, vehicles, and fortifications. They broke up German counterattacks before they could develop. They shattered supply lines and communications centers. They did all of this from positions German artillery couldn't reach. Generalfeldmarschall Kasserine, commanding German forces in Italy, sent increasingly desperate requests to Berlin for equivalent weapons. In March 1944, he personally requested long-range artillery to counter American guns that were systematically destroying his forces. Berlin responded by shipping 3 21-centimeter Mercer 18 units to Italy, 12 guns total. These weapons had a maximum range of 16,700 yards, still 8,000 yards short of the Long Tom. It was inadequate firepower arriving far too late to change anything. By June 1944, American artillery doctrine had evolved completely around the Long Tom's capabilities. The invasion of Normandy, the largest amphibious operation in history, would prove how thoroughly the United States had integrated this weapon into combined arms warfare. 33 Long Tom battalions deployed to the European theater for the invasion. Over 130 individual guns, each capable of reaching 14 miles inland from beachhead positions. The numbers themselves told a story about American industrial capacity. In 1942, the United States had produced 20 Long Toms total. In 1943, production ramped to 340 guns. By mid-1944, production exceeded 60 guns per month. The factory at Mesta Machine Company in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was completing one Long Tom every 12 hours around the clock. Germany, fighting a total war with its entire economy mobilized, produced 68 21-centimeter Mercer 18 units during all of 1944. 68 comparable weapons across all fronts for the entire year. The United States was building more Long Toms every 3 weeks than Germany built equivalent weapons annually. The industrial disparity wasn't just significant, it was crushing. On June 6, 1944, as Allied forces stormed Normandy beaches under withering German fire, Long Tom batteries positioned on ships offshore provided covering fire. The USS Texas, a battleship converted specifically for artillery support, carried 3 Long Toms mounted on deck. They fired over the heads of landing troops, their shells landing on German positions miles inland, suppressing coastal defenses long enough for infantry to establish footholds. Once beachheads were secured, Long Tom units came ashore. The logistics were staggering. Each gun weighed over 15 tons. Each required a specialized M4 high-speed tractor to move it. Each needed a 15-man crew, ammunition supply vehicles, fire direction centers, forward observer teams. Yet American engineers made it work. By June 9th, D+3, the first batteries were emplaced on French soil. By June 12th, 8 complete battalions were operational and firing. German forces in Normandy found themselves facing an artillery storm unlike anything they'd experienced, and the Wehrmacht had experienced brutal artillery on the Eastern Front. But Soviet artillery, while plentiful, rarely achieved the precision and range of American guns. Forward observers embedded with American infantry called in coordinates on German positions. Within minutes, 100-pound shells would arrive from guns positioned 10 miles away. The shells came without warning, without any visible sign of where they originated. German soldiers learned to fear the whistle of incoming rounds because it meant death was arriving from beyond the horizon. The Long Tom's accuracy at extreme range proved particularly devastating against German armor. A direct hit from a 100-pound high-explosive shell would mission-kill even a Tiger tank. The blast could shatter tracks, destroy optics, kill crew members through sheer concussion even if the armor held. Near misses damaged suspensions, broke radio antennas, wounded infantry supporting the tanks. And unlike tank versus tank combat, where German armor held advantages in frontal armor and gunpowder, there was no armor thick enough to ignore a 100-pound shell landing on your engine deck. On June 28th, near the town of St. Lo, a single Long Tom battery from the 557th Field Artillery Battalion destroyed 5 Panther tanks in 17 minutes. The tanks were positioned 19,000 yards away, over 10 miles, supporting German infantry preparing to counterattack. Forward observers spotted them through binoculars and called coordinates. The first round landed 200 yards beyond the tanks. Adjustment. The second landed 100 yards short. Adjustment. The third landed directly among them. What followed was methodical destruction. Each Panther became a separate target. Fire. Adjust. Fire again. The tanks never saw the American gun, never determined what direction the shells came from, never had opportunity to retreat or take cover. They simply exploded one after another, their crews dying without ever seeing their killer. Oberst Hans von Luck, commanding the 125th Panzer Grenadier Regiment, witnessed that engagement from 2 miles away. He watched 5 of his supporting tanks destroyed in minutes by fire from positions he couldn't locate. That night, he wrote in his diary words that captured German frustration perfectly. "We are being hunted by artillery that can reach anywhere. My tanks cannot advance without being spotted and destroyed from impossible ranges. My infantry cannot concentrate without being shelled. My supply columns are destroyed before they reach the front. The Americans have turned artillery into omnipresent death." After the breakout from Normandy in late July 1944, American forces swept across France at speeds that seemed impossible by any historical standard. General George Patton's Third Army advanced 600 miles in 6 weeks, faster than any army in modern history, faster than the German blitzkrieg through France in 1940. Long Tom battalions made that speed possible. Traditional artillery required extensive setup time. Surveyors had to establish precise positions. Gun crews needed hours to level platforms, calculate azimuths, establish communications. The Long Tom simplified everything. Find reasonably level ground, extend the trail legs, calculate firing solutions from map coordinates, start shooting. 30 minutes from arrival to first round downrange. And because they could reach 14 miles, Long Toms didn't need to constantly reposition as armies advanced. A battery could set up once, support operations for 2 or 3 days while ground forces moved forward 30 miles, then leapfrog to a new position behind the advancing front. It was mobile warfare enabled by guns that barely moved, a paradox that German commanders couldn't counter. The 191st Field Artillery Battalion, attached to Patton's Third Army, kept meticulous records during the pursuit across France. Between August 1st and September 15th, 1944, they displaced their positions 23 times, traveled 412 miles total, and fired 18,847 rounds. They destroyed 127 confirmed German targets, including vehicles, artillery pieces, and supply dumps. And most remarkably, they suffered 0 casualties from enemy fire. 0. The Long Tom's range kept crews safe from German retaliation, even during one of the most rapid advances in military history. On September 3, 1944, the 191st achieved something unprecedented in artillery warfare. They shelled German positions near Metz from positions still in Luxembourg, firing across an international border. The German positions sat 23,500 yards away, 13.4 miles. Forward observers in aircraft spotted targets and radioed coordinates. The Long Toms fired, adjusted based on aerial observation, fired again. German defenders being shelled had no idea where the fire originated. They couldn't see gun flashes, couldn't hear reports, couldn't determine direction. Artillery was arriving from beyond the curvature of the earth, as far as they could tell. A captured German officer, Hauptmann Werner Schmidt, revealed German frustration during his interrogation after the Metz action. "We knew the Americans had long-range guns," he said. "We'd fought them in Italy. But the scale in France, it's everywhere. Every time we deploy, within an hour shells start falling. We move positions, they follow us. We dig in, they find us anyway. My battalion lost 40% strength to American artillery before we ever saw American infantry. How do you fight an enemy you cannot reach?" That question, how do you fight an enemy you cannot reach, became the central problem facing German commanders in the West. They had no good answer. German artillery doctrine had developed over decades, refined through multiple wars, based on rough parity and range. Whoever positioned guns first, whoever had better observation, whoever calculated faster, would win artillery duels. The Long Tom shattered that paradigm. There was no parity when one side could shoot 5 miles farther than the other. There was only systematic destruction of German positions by fire they couldn't return. In December 1944, Germany launched its last major offensive, a desperate gamble to split Allied armies and capture the vital port of Antwerp. The initial assault caught American forces off guard. German panzers broke through thinly held lines, advancing rapidly through the Ardennes forest in weather so bad that American air power was grounded. German commanders had planned for this, knowing Americans relied heavily on air support. What they hadn't fully appreciated was how effective American artillery remained when aircraft couldn't fly. 19 Long Tom battalions operated in the Ardennes sector when the offensive began. As German forces advanced, these batteries repositioned rapidly, establishing new firing positions within hours and immediately resuming fire on German columns. The weather that grounded aircraft didn't affect artillery. Forward observers on the ground could still spot targets, radios still worked, and Long Tom shells still arrived with devastating accuracy regardless of clouds, snow, or fog. On December 22nd, near Bastogne, The 578th Field Artillery Battalion positioned 4 long toms 8 miles northwest of the besieged town. German forces surrounding Bastogne found themselves under sustained artillery fire from positions they couldn't assault. Attacking those guns would require pulling forces from the siege and advancing through American defensive lines, something German commanders couldn't afford. So the shells kept coming. 600 rounds per day per battery, targeting German assembly areas, supply routes, artillery positions, breaking up attacks before they developed, shattering troop concentrations, destroying supply vehicles. When Patton's Third Army broke through to Bastogne on December 26th, the 578th had fired 9,847 rounds in 5 days. Their gun barrels were worn smooth, accuracy degraded from constant firing, crews exhausted from round-the-clock operations. But they'd helped save Bastogne. Across the entire Ardennes sector, Long Tom batteries fired an estimated 180,000 rounds during December 1944 and January 1945. German forces advancing through forests and villages found themselves under constant bombardment from guns they couldn't locate, couldn't reach, couldn't silence. The German offensive collapsed in early January 1945. Multiple factors contributed. Stubborn American infantry resistance that refused to break despite being surrounded. Eventually, clear weather that allowed devastating airstrikes. Fuel shortages that crippled German armor. But German after-action reports, written by professional officers analyzing their own defeat, consistently cited American artillery as the decisive factor. A Wehrmacht operational analysis from January 27th stated it bluntly. The American artillery advantage in the Ardennes was decisive. Their long-range guns positioned far behind lines maintained continuous fire throughout the offensive. Counter-battery operations were largely ineffective due to range disparities. Estimated 40% of German casualties resulted from artillery fire. Without American artillery superiority, breakthrough might have been achieved. 40% casualties from artillery alone, not airstrikes, not tank battles, not infantry combat. Artillery. And the Long Tom, with its 14-mile reach and 100-pound shells, was the centerpiece of that artillery superiority. By April 1945, American forces in Europe fielded 49 Long Tom battalions, 196 individual guns operational across the European and Mediterranean theaters. Production statistics told the story of American industrial capacity translated into firepower. The United States had produced 1 prototype in 1938, 4 guns in 1939, 12 in 1940, 20 in 1941, 89 in 1942, 340 in 1943, 892 in 1944, 522 through August 1945. Total production reached 1,880 guns. Each Long Tom required 30,600 pounds of steel and specialized alloys, 412 individual machined components, 47 specialized forgings, 23,000 rivets and fasteners, 890 feet of hydraulic tubing, 67 precision bearings. The barrel alone required 92 hours of machining time on specialized equipment. The carriage assembly took 156 man-hours. Final assembly and testing added another 78 hours. Yet American factories produced these complex machines at a rate exceeding 2 per day during peak production in 1944. Germany never developed an equivalent weapon. Their 21-centimeter Mercer 18 remained in limited production throughout the war. Total German production of all heavy artillery pieces in 1944 was approximately 2,800 guns, and that included howitzers, mortars, and anti-aircraft weapons. Purpose-built long-range field guns comparable to the Long Tom? Germany produced none. The industrial disparity was crushing. American factories were outproducing German industry in every category, but nowhere was it more evident than in heavy artillery. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, Allied forces possessed 196 operational Long Toms, over 4 million rounds of ammunition stockpiled, replacement gun tubes for every system, and fully trained replacement crews ready to deploy. German forces possessed an estimated 180 heavy artillery pieces of all types still operational, critically low ammunition stocks with some units down to fewer than 10 rounds per gun, no replacement capacity, and crews depleted by casualties and desertion. The Wehrmacht had been outproduced, outgunned, and ultimately overwhelmed. In a post-war interview conducted by American military intelligence, General Oberst Alfred Jodl, chief of the operations staff of the German Armed Forces High Command, was asked what single weapon had most surprised the Wehrmacht during the war. His answer was immediate. The American long-range artillery. We knew they had industrial capacity. We knew they could build many weapons. We didn't realize they would apply that capacity so effectively to battlefield weapons. Their 155mm gun, the Long Tom, redefined artillery warfare. We had nothing comparable. We never developed an effective counter. By the time we understood what we faced, it was too late. That admission, from one of Germany's most senior military leaders, captured the essential truth. The Long Tom wasn't just a better gun. It represented a fundamental shift in how artillery could be employed, range that placed it beyond enemy retaliation, accuracy that made every shot count, mobility that kept it relevant in fast-moving operations, and most importantly, production capacity that ensured every American corps had access to this decisive weapon. German soldiers who'd mocked the Long Tom as impractical American excess in 1942 were dead or captured by 1945, killed by the very weapon they'd dismissed. The Pacific War presented challenges that European battlefields never posed. Instead of sweeping across continents, American forces island-hopped across thousands of miles of ocean. Each island was a fortress, each landing an amphibious assault against defenders who'd spent months fortifying caves, bunkers, and mountainsides. Artillery support in Europe could be positioned behind established front lines. In the Pacific, artillery had to come ashore under fire, be emplaced on beaches swept by enemy mortars, and support operations on terrain that ranged from coral atolls to volcanic mountains to dense jungle. 8 Long Tom battalions deployed to the Pacific Theater. The 168th, 223rd, 226th, 433rd, 517th, 531st, 532nd, and 983rd Field Artillery Battalions, alongside several Marine Corps batteries, brought America's heaviest field artillery to a war zone, where moving a 15-ton gun across beaches and through jungles seemed nearly impossible. But the Pacific War rewrote the rules on what was possible. On March 31, 1945, Marines of the Amphibious Reconnaissance Battalion landed without opposition on Kasserine, 4 tiny islets just 8 miles west of Naha, the capital of Okinawa. The islands were specks on the map, coral outcroppings barely large enough to support battalion-sized forces. But they had one critical attribute. They were within Long Tom range of Okinawa itself. Within 24 hours, Long Tom batteries were ashore on Kasserine. The logistics were staggering. Each gun weighed over 15 tons. Each required a specialized tractor to move it. The tractors couldn't simply drive across beaches like tanks. They needed temporary roads built from coral rubble, steel matting laid down by engineers under fire, coordination between Navy landing craft, Army artillery units, and Marine infantry providing security. Yet American forces made it work. By April 1st, when the main invasion force hit Okinawa's beaches, long toms on Kasserine were already firing, their shells reaching 13 miles across water to strike Japanese positions on Okinawa proper. Japanese defenders on Okinawa couldn't comprehend what was happening. Artillery fire was arriving from positions they couldn't see, couldn't attack, couldn't even accurately locate. The Americans had positioned heavy guns on islands too small to support large garrisons, islands the Japanese had dismissed as strategically irrelevant. Now those irrelevant islands hosted weapons that could reach anywhere on southern Okinawa. Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, commanding Japanese forces on Okinawa, faced the same problem German commanders had confronted in Europe, but with fewer options. In Europe, German forces could at least attempt to advance and threaten American artillery positions. On Okinawa, Japanese forces were trapped on the island with no way to reach guns positioned across 8 miles of ocean. The long toms on Kasserine could fire with impunity, adjusting based on aerial observation and forward observer reports, systematically destroying Japanese positions that had taken months to construct. The Battle of Okinawa became an artillery duel, where one side possessed weapons the other couldn't reach. Japanese artillery, when it did fire, immediately drew devastating counter-battery fire from American guns that outranged them by thousands of yards. On May 13th, Japanese artillery came out of concealment to support a major counterattack, firing 13,000 rounds in support of infantry assaults. American long toms, along with shorter-range howitzers and naval gunfire, destroyed dozens of Japanese artillery pieces within hours. The Japanese attack failed, broken not by infantry resistance, but by artillery fire that annihilated Japanese forces before they could close with American lines. The Philippines campaign had demonstrated the long tom's value in Pacific Island warfare even before Okinawa. In October 1944, American forces returned to the Philippines after 2 years of Japanese occupation. Long tom batteries came ashore at Leyte Gulf, positioning themselves to support the advance inland. The terrain was brutal, dense jungle interspersed with rice paddies, mountains rising abruptly from coastal plains, roads that became impassable mud during tropical downpours. Artillery crews found themselves working in conditions that would have seemed impossible in European warfare. Photographs from the Philippines show American artillerymen standing ankle-deep in rainwater, cleaning projectiles for firing. The long tom's barrel pointed skyward through gaps in jungle canopy. Yet the guns kept firing. Japanese forces on Leyte attempted the same defensive tactics that had worked on earlier Pacific islands: establish positions in mountains and caves, force Americans to assault uphill under fire, make them pay in blood for every yard. The long tom negated those tactics. American forward observers working with infantry battalions struggling through jungle called coordinates back to batteries positioned near the beaches. The long toms fired over the heads of advancing troops, their shells arcing miles inland to strike Japanese positions in mountains that infantry hadn't yet reached. Japanese forces on Leyte found themselves under artillery bombardment days before American ground forces arrived. Supply lines were cut, command posts were destroyed, defensive positions were shattered. By the time American infantry actually assaulted those positions, Japanese defenders had already been subjected to days of continuous bombardment from guns they'd never seen. The psychological effect was devastating. Japanese soldiers fighting on Pacific islands expected American firepower. They'd faced it on Guadalcanal, Tarawa, Saipan, but the Long Tom brought a new dimension of terror. Previous American artillery could be located, estimated, sometimes even engaged with counterfire. The Long Tom struck from beyond any possible retaliation. Its shells simply appeared day and night, destroying positions with mechanical precision. A Japanese officer captured on Leyte during interrogation provided insight into how Long Tom fire affected Japanese morale. "We could not understand where the shells came from," he stated. "Our artillery officers calculated that American guns must be positioned 15 or 20 kilometers away, but this seemed impossible. No field artillery has such range. We thought perhaps it was naval gunfire, but the Americans had no ships near our positions. The shells came from nowhere, struck everywhere. My men began to believe the Americans had supernatural weapons." That belief, that Americans possessed weapons beyond normal military technology, spread through Japanese forces across the Pacific. It wasn't entirely wrong. The Long Tom represented a level of industrial sophistication and battlefield capability that Japan couldn't match. Japanese heavy artillery consisted primarily of the Type 96 150mm howitzer with a maximum range of 12,000 yards, barely 7 miles. Japanese gunners facing Long Toms were outranged by over 7,000 yards, nearly 4 miles. In Pacific Island warfare, where distances were measured in single-digit miles, that range difference was insurmountable. Marine Corps artillery units operating in the Central Pacific made extensive use of Long Toms despite the logistical challenges. The 7th 155mm Gun Battalion, 3rd Amphibious Corps Artillery, deployed Long Toms to Guam in July 1944. Getting the guns ashore required specialized landing craft, engineer support to build temporary roads across beaches, and security forces to hold beachheads long enough for heavy artillery to be emplaced. Marines made it work through sheer determination and excellent coordination between assault units and support elements. On Guam, Long Toms provided fire support for Marine advances through terrain that seemed purpose-built to favor defenders. Limestone cliffs honeycombed with caves, dense jungle reducing visibility to yards. Japanese defenders who'd prepared positions for months. The Long Toms, positioned on beaches and in cleared areas near the coast, fired into the island's interior, their shells reaching positions 8 to 10 miles inland. Japanese forces, trapped between American infantry advancing from the beaches and artillery fire reaching their rear areas, found themselves in an impossible tactical situation. The Battle of Guam lasted 3 weeks. During that time, Marine Long Tom batteries fired over 20,000 rounds. They destroyed hundreds of Japanese positions, shattered counterattacks before they could develop, and provided continuous fire support for infantry operating in some of the most difficult terrain imaginable. When Guam was declared secure in August 1944, captured Japanese documents revealed the effectiveness of American artillery. Japanese casualty reports attributed over 30% of their losses to artillery fire, with American long-range guns specifically noted as causing disproportionate damage. The contrast with Japanese artillery capabilities was stark. Japan had entered World War II with artillery doctrine focused on direct fire support and relatively short ranges. Their industry couldn't produce the precision components necessary for guns like the Long Tom. The complex recoil systems, the high-grade steel for barrels that could withstand thousands of firings at extreme pressure, the optical sights and fire control equipment, all required manufacturing capabilities that Japan's industrial base lacked. Japanese artillery was adequate for the warfare they'd planned, supporting infantry assaults in China and defensive operations on Pacific islands. But it couldn't compete with American guns in range, accuracy, or sustained fire capability. By 1945, as American forces prepared for the planned invasion of Japan itself, Long Tom batteries were positioned throughout the Pacific theater. They sat on Okinawa, the Philippines, Guam, Saipan, ready to support what military planners expected would be the bloodiest campaign of the war. The guns would have been crucial in any invasion of the Japanese home islands, providing the long-range fire support necessary to suppress Japanese defensive positions while American forces established beachheads. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki made that invasion unnecessary. But the Long Toms remained, testimony to American industrial capacity and battlefield innovation. In the Pacific theater, they'd fired over 150,000 rounds, supported 17 major amphibious operations, and helped break Japanese defensive positions that seemed impregnable. They'd done this while operating in conditions far removed from the European battlefields where artillery doctrine had been developed. Jungles, coral atolls, volcanic islands, tropical storms that turned gun positions into mud pits. These challenges would have defeated lesser weapons systems. The Long Tom succeeded because American doctrine adapted to circumstances. In Europe, Long Toms supported mechanized advances across open terrain. In the Pacific, they provided fire support for amphibious operations across vast ocean distances. The gun itself didn't change. American tactics did, proving that the best weapons are those flexible enough to be employed in multiple roles across different types of warfare. After the war, when military analysts studied artillery effectiveness across all theaters, the Long Tom's record stood out. In Europe, it had outranged and outfought German artillery. In the Pacific, it had provided fire support under conditions that seemed to preclude heavy artillery use. Total rounds fired across both theaters exceeded 900,000. Total confirmed targets destroyed exceeded 15,000. And most remarkably, Long Tom casualty rates remained among the lowest of any weapon system in the American arsenal. The 14-mile reach that German and Japanese forces had dismissed as impractical had proved to be the gun's greatest asset, keeping crews safe while delivering devastating firepower to any point on the battlefield. When the Korean War erupted in June 1950, the Long Tom was among the first American heavy artillery pieces rushed to the peninsula. The weapons that had terrorized German and Japanese forces in World War II found themselves facing a new enemy in terrain that seemed specifically designed to challenge artillery operations. Korea's mountains were steeper than Italy's. Its roads were worse than anything in the Pacific. Winter temperatures plunged to 40 below zero, cold enough to freeze hydraulic fluid and crack gun barrels. The Long Tom kept firing. American and United Nations forces deployed Long Toms, redesignated as the M59 in post-war reorganization, to support operations across the Korean peninsula. The guns that had shelled German positions from 15 miles away now provided counter-battery fire against North Korean and Chinese artillery dug into mountains. The same 14-mile reach that had frustrated the Wehrmacht proved equally devastating against communist forces who'd expected artillery duels fought at 6 or 7 miles maximum. Chinese forces entering the war in October 1950 encountered American artillery firepower that exceeded anything they'd faced against the Japanese or during their Civil War. Chinese commanders, studying Soviet artillery doctrine that emphasized mass over range, positioned their guns at distances they thought safe. Then, long-tom shells started arriving, systematically destroying positions before Chinese gunners even knew they were under fire. It was North Africa all over again. European battlefields replayed in Asian mountains. The same tactical revolution demonstrated once more. The gun saw continuous service through the Korean War's 3 years, firing in conditions that would have defeated lesser weapons. Winter campaigns where crews worked in temperatures cold enough to cause frostbite in minutes. Summer monsoons that turned gun positions into mud pits requiring constant repositioning. Mountain warfare where every displacement meant hauling 15 tons of steel up roads barely wide enough for the tractor towing it. Yet the Long Tom remained America's primary corps-level artillery piece throughout the conflict, proving that the design's fundamental soundness transcended specific wars or enemies. After Korea, the Long Tom remained in service with American forces and allied nations well into the 1960s. The gun that had first fired in anger on Christmas Eve 1942 was still providing fire support 2 decades later in Vietnam. Some Long Toms deployed to Southeast Asia, their crews training South Vietnamese artillerymen on weapons older than many of the trainees themselves. The gun's longevity testified to its enduring effectiveness. In an era when military technology advanced rapidly, when jet aircraft replaced propeller fighters within years and missiles supplanted bombers, the Long Tom remained relevant because its fundamental capability, delivering 100-pound shells accurately to 14 miles, remained tactically valuable. Other nations recognized this value. Britain received 184 Long Toms through Lend-Lease during World War II. British artillery units, including 4 batteries from Newfoundland, employed 88 guns in combat operations. After the war, Britain adopted the Long Tom as their standard heavy gun, using it until the 1950s when newer designs finally replaced it. The British called it simply the 155, dropping the nickname in favor of caliber designation. But British artillerymen who'd used it spoke of the weapon with respect, bordering on affection. France received 25 guns through Lend-Lease and continued using them post-war. Israel acquired Long Toms and employed them during early Arab-Israeli conflicts, finding the gun's range particularly valuable in defensive operations where positioning guns safely behind lines while still reaching enemy positions proved decisive. Austria, the Netherlands, Pakistan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Turkey all operated Long Toms at various points, testimony to the weapon's international appeal. A gun designed by American engineers in the 1930s proved adaptable enough for use by armies across 3 continents, facing vastly different tactical situations. The self-propelled variant, the M40 gun motor carriage, extended the Long Tom's relevance even further. Mounting the gun on a modified Sherman tank chassis created a mobile artillery piece that combined the Long Tom's range with armored protection and tactical mobility. The M40 saw limited service in World War II but proved its worth in Korea, where its ability to displace rapidly after firing prevented counter-battery retaliation. Some M40s remained in service into the 1960s, making them among the last Sherman-based vehicles in active military use. But perhaps the Long Tom's most enduring legacy wasn't its service record or international adoption. It was the fundamental shift in artillery doctrine it represented. Before the Long Tom, artillery range was measured in single-digit miles, guns positioned close to front lines, duels fought at distances where both sides could reach each other. The Long Tom demonstrated that artillery could be employed differently, positioned far behind lines yet still reaching deep into enemy territory, safe from retaliation yet delivering devastating firepower. This doctrine, positioning long-range artillery beyond enemy reach while maintaining fire support across entire battlefield depth, became standard in post-war American military thinking. Modern artillery systems like the M198 howitzer and M777 rocket system owe conceptual debt to the Long Tom's demonstration that range equals survivability and effectiveness. The principle that artillery crews should never be exposed to direct enemy fire, that guns should strike from positions the enemy cannot reach, seems obvious now. It wasn't obvious in 1942. The Long Tom made it so. By the 1970s, the last Long Toms were finally retired from active service. The guns that had first fired at German positions in Tunisia were museum pieces, their barrels worn smooth from decades of use, their carriages showing wear from countless displacements across battlefields spanning 3 continents. Military museums across America and Europe preserve these weapons now. One sits at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, where American artillerymen still train. Another occupies a place of honor at the Omaha Beach Memorial Museum in Normandy. A third stands at the Georgia Veterans State Park, a testament to the industrial might that produced it. German veterans who'd faced Long Toms during World War II rarely spoke publicly about specific weapons in the immediate post-war years. Germany was focused on rebuilding, on moving past military matters entirely. But in private, among fellow soldiers at reunions and gatherings, former Wehrmacht officers acknowledged what they'd faced. In a 1978 interview conducted for a German military history project, a former artillery commander who'd fought in Normandy spoke candidly about American firepower. "We knew we were outgunned," he stated. "We'd known it since North Africa. But knowing and experiencing are different things. The American long-range gun, the 155mm they called Long Tom, represented everything we feared about American industrial capacity. They built it better than we could build comparable weapons. They built it in quantities we couldn't match. They used it more effectively than we thought possible. And every time we heard those shells arriving from positions we couldn't reach, we were reminded that we were fighting an enemy whose resources were effectively unlimited." That assessment, delivered 3 decades after the war, captured the essential truth about the Long Tom's impact. It wasn't just a better gun. It was proof of American industrial and technological superiority translated into tactical dominance. German artillery pieces were well designed, properly manufactured, effectively employed. They simply couldn't compete with weapons that outranged them by miles, that were produced in overwhelming numbers, that were supported by logistical systems capable of delivering millions of rounds wherever American forces fought. Japanese perspectives, when they emerged decades after the war, echoed German experiences. A Japanese artillery officer who'd fought on Okinawa provided his assessment in a 1985 interview. "We could not understand how the Americans positioned such heavy guns on tiny islands and brought them ashore during invasions. Our artillery doctrine assumed guns would be pre-positioned on defended territory. The Americans made artillery mobile in ways we thought impossible. And their range, always their range. We could not reply to fire from positions we could not even see." The mathematics that had seemed impossible to German intelligence in 1942, the range that Japanese commanders dismissed as propaganda, became reality demonstrated through hundreds of thousands of rounds fired in combat. 25,395 yards maximum range, 14.4 miles. That single number, achieved through American engineering and maintained through industrial capacity, redefined what field artillery could accomplish. In the end, the story of the Long Tom is the story of how industrial logic defeated tactical brilliance, how quantity and quality merged into overwhelming superiority, and how the weapon German officers mocked as impractical became the gun they feared most. From Christmas Eve 1942 in the Tunisian desert to the final shots fired in Korea, the Long Tom delivered over 1 million rounds in combat, supported hundreds of thousands of American and Allied soldiers, and helped break enemy forces across multiple continents. The crews who served these guns, 15-man teams working in conditions ranging from North African heat to Korean cold, loading 100-pound shells by hand, adjusting for wind and temperature and target distance, firing again and again until barrels grew too hot to touch, deserve remembrance alongside the weapon itself. They turned engineering specifications into battlefield reality. They proved that American artillerymen, many of them civilians just months before entering service, could master complex weapons systems and employ them with devastating effectiveness. The Germans who'd laughed at the P-47 Thunderbolt learned to fear its .850 caliber guns. The Germans who'd dismissed the Long Tom as impractical learned to dread the thunder of its shells arriving from beyond the horizon. Both weapons, along with countless others, demonstrated that American military might in World War II rested on more than courage or tactics. It rested on industrial capacity to produce superior weapons in overwhelming numbers, on engineering capability to design systems that worked under combat conditions, and on logistical excellence to deliver ammunition and supplies wherever American forces fought. The Long Tom embodied all these advantages. It was over-engineered by European standards, built with tolerances tighter than necessary, constructed from higher-grade materials than strictly required. It was produced in numbers that seemed excessive, until those numbers proved decisive on battlefields where quantity meant victory. It was supported by supply chains that delivered millions of rounds of precisely manufactured ammunition to guns fighting thousands of miles from American factories. And when the guns finally fell silent, when the last Long Tom was retired and moved to museums, the weapon left behind a legacy that shaped artillery doctrine for generations. Every modern artillery system that emphasizes range, every doctrine that positions guns safely behind lines, every calculation that treats artillery reach as the decisive factor in fire support acknowledges lessons the Long Tom taught through combat from 1942 to 1953. German officers in North Africa had asked how to fight an enemy you cannot reach. The answer, learned too late to save the Wehrmacht, was simple: you don't. When one side possesses weapons that can strike from positions the enemy cannot threaten, when industrial capacity ensures those weapons remain supplied and supported regardless of losses, when doctrine maximizes every advantage those weapons provide, the outcome isn't in doubt. It's just a matter of time until superior reach translates into complete victory. The Long Tom didn't just outrange German and Japanese artillery. It outranged their capacity to respond, their ability to adapt, their industrial potential to counter, and in doing so, it demonstrated a truth that shaped the rest of the 20th century. In modern warfare, the side that can deliver decisive firepower from positions of safety possesses an advantage that tactics and courage alone cannot overcome. The Germans learned this in Tunisia, Italy, France, and Belgium. The Japanese learned it across Pacific Islands from Guam to Okinawa. And the lesson, paid for in blood and steel, taught by a gun that German intelligence dismissed as impractical and Japanese commanders thought impossible, was this: never underestimate American industrial capacity to turn engineering into dominance, to build weapons that rewrite tactical assumptions, and to produce them in numbers that turn individual superiority into overwhelming force. The thunder of the Long Tom has been silent for decades now, but its legacy echoes through every artillery piece, every fire support calculation, every doctrine that recognizes range as the ultimate artillery advantage. And that legacy, forged in deserts and mountains and jungles across 2 continents, remains the Long Tom's final and most lasting victory.